Thanks, James.
All right, so a little bit of word of introduction here. As Evan said, my name is Nate Shepard, and I have a bit of an unusual project for you tonight. So I do media production. I'm trying to work on building up a business, doing different types of media. And part of what I like about media production is finding new ways to tell stories. And so when I learned that this month's In Progress was on Halloween night, I had an idea, and I ran with it. And so what I'm going to do tonight is I want to tell you an original Halloween story, but with a bit of a twist. So as you can see, I love using modern technology to create unique multimedia experiences, as Evan so eloquently put it, in small spaces. So I just love that idea of taking that big production value and bringing it into the living room kind of space. And so tonight is what I'm calling an immersive Halloween tale. Now, what do I mean by immersive Halloween tale? Well, let's see if this works. Basically what I want to do is use sound effects and 3D projection to tell my story, as well as some theme-appropriate music. I met Daleth at the last In Progress, and when I discovered his love for retro music, I knew I had to give this a try. So tonight I'll be telling you, as I said, an original short story I wrote for just for this occasion called Up Near the Edges. And I'll also be using sound effects and atmospheric projections to help tell this story. This is something I hope to continue to develop, but tonight is my first time ever doing this live, and so I appreciate your willingness to try something new, to experiment with me, and of course a huge thanks to Daleth for helping me dial in a classic 80s vibe for this Halloween tale. So, without further ado, let's give this a shot. Gary Rousseau sank slowly into his favorite leather chair, his wrinkled fingers grasping an almost empty glass of whiskey. He'd been up for nearly 2 days straight looking for Billy Anderson. He'd left no stone unturned, but found no trace of the boy. He blinked slowly. Even in his younger days, a case this complicated would have wiped him out completely. With a sigh, he propped up his worn-out slippers on the Persian ottoman, wishing for the 100th time that he could just retire and call the whole detective thing off for good. But this town had no one else to turn to when things got suspicious. So Gary was never at a lack for trouble to investigate. And besides, what else would he do? With only his old dog Shadow to keep him company at nights. It got particularly cold and lonely in late autumn. But as he took a long sip from his glass, the worries of the day began to melt away into the coziness of the fire and the heaviness of his eyelids. A sudden knock at the door startled him from his slumber. Rubbing the fog of too much whiskey from his eyes, he slowly sat up. The knock rang out again. "I'm coming," Gary mumbled. He unlatched the door to find a distraught woman holding an empty leash. "Nancy," Gary said with surprise. "What in God's name possessed you?" "It's Grover," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "Your dog?" he asked. "Yes, he's gone missing." "I'm sure he's just wandered off." Gary found it hard to mask his annoyance. "Did you really have to come out?" "This is different, Detective Rousseau. I heard him..." She trailed off. "Fine," he sighed. "If you're really that concerned about him, but I'm sure he'll be home by morning." No, I lost him near Mad Jack's place. Gary shuddered. Jack Brown, known to most of the locals as Old Mad Jack, lived alone in his shack out in the middle of the woods. Rumors about the bizarre old man buzzed around town, and many were convinced his place was haunted. No one had heard from him in several months, but that wasn't unusual, as Old Mad Jack only came out a few times a year. Don't be ridiculous, Gary said to Nancy, though he felt like he was saying it more to himself. I don't believe any of that nonsense about Jack. He's just an old guy like me. We were walking down Elm Avenue, Nancy continued as if she hadn't heard him. I take Grover out that way most nights, but this time he got a whiff of something foul. It wasn't long before I smelled it too, like a dead cat under a porch. His hair bristled and he growled something fierce. It's not like my Grover to growl like that. And then, without warning, he bolted so fast I lost hold of him. I spent nearly an hour calling out for him, and all I found was this. She held up the leash with the trembling hands. The end where Grover's collar used to be was shredded, as if something had ripped the leash in half. What do you make of that? Nancy shivered. It probably just got caught in some bushes and had to chew his way out, Gary replied with a sidelong glance out the door behind her into the misty night. It was out by the edges, by Old Jack's place, Nancy insisted. That man's got something fishy going on and you know it. Besides, have you been looking for that Anderson boy out that way? What are you talking about? Gary said apprehensively. Don't be so coy, she said. Everyone knows you've been looking for him. Real shame, isn't it? Yes, he replied, running a hand absently through his hair. Well, all right, if it'll make you feel better, but once we find that dog, I'm hanging up my hat for good. Oh, thank you, Detective. Nancy's eyes started to water. Don't mention it, Gary said, turning away. Let me just grab my jacket. As he grabbed his coat from where he'd thrown it only a few hours earlier, he instinctively grabbed his pistol as well. Come on, boy, he called to Shadow as he followed Nancy into the night. It wasn't long until Gary's rusty Chevy was parked on the outskirts of the forest on the northern end of town, a place known among the locals as the Edges. Most people preferred to stay away from the area, especially at night. The ground was thick with fog as Gary helped Nancy retrace her steps to where she lost track of Grover. Shadow hung close to Gary's heels, sniffing apprehensively. The air was rank with some dark odor, just as Nancy had said. Gary bent down to the ground to examine the spot where Grover had dashed away. The dog must have been running as fast as it could, which was fortunate as it had left a clear trail of broken branches and trampled underbrush. Beckoning Nancy to follow, he picked his way carefully through the trees, following the trail left by the clearly distraught hound. Was he chasing something? Or was something chasing him? Gary asked. I think you know the answer, Nancy shuddered. It was then that Gary noticed something that made his stomach turn. He knelt suddenly to the ground. What is it, Detective? Nancy whispered tensely. Blood. Gary rose and walked slowly into the ever-deepening underbrush. You might want to stay here, he said, with a warning hand held out behind him. I've got a bad feeling about this. No, Nancy said through a stifled sob. I must find my Grover. The minutes ticked by like hours as they carefully followed the trail until a sudden bark startled them. What is it, Shadow? Gary ran after the dog, which had picked up a scent and was now dashing through the brambly undergrowth toward a pale bulldog lying at the base of a tree. Grover! Nancy shouted as she ran to where the dog lay. Gary followed and knelt beside the poor creature, who was whimpering and breathing heavily. Something got him, he said solemnly. A bear, maybe? It looks like he'll be all right if we can get him help soon, but whatever it was, your dog is damn lucky to be alive. Nancy buried her face in Grover's fur as Gary stood and looked around the forest, hoping to find some clues in the night's unfolding mysteries. And then he saw it. Mad Jack's cabin. It was only a few hundred feet from where they stood, and it looked as though it might fall over at any moment. Dark and dilapidated, the leaning structure did not provide any solace for the detective. Getting too old for this, he mumbled to himself as he took a few cautious steps toward the shack. Where are you going? Nancy called out behind him. Jack's the only one who might know what did this. I'm going to check in with him, he said. Then he added under his breath, if he's still alive. Shadow followed close at his heels as he walked up to the door of the shack and knocked firmly. Jack, he called out. Jack, it's Detective Gary. I just wanted to ask you a few questions. No response came from within the dark cabin. Gary knocked a few more times and then with a sigh gave up and returned to Nancy and Grover, who were still at the base of the tree. We should really get him out of here, Nancy said. You can finish your investigation later. It's just weird, Gary said. What kind of animal would just leave its prey like that? Not to mention the foul smell. Seems like a rather unusual creature was after your dog, but why would it leave? I don't know, and I don't care to find out, Detective. Can we please get out of here? It's almost like bait, the detective ignored her pleading. Like whatever it was wanted something to find Grover. Suddenly, a low, throaty growl unlike anything Gary had ever heard rumbled through the forest from just beyond the shack. Oh, please, Nancy stammered, too overcome with fear to say anything more. What in the world? Gary reached for his pistol and drew it from its holster. Two large reptilian eyes appeared in the dark just to the left of the shack. They had an unnatural, sickly orange glow, almost as if they had a fire inside of them. The creature growled again and stepped forward into the dim moonlight. That's no bear, Gary said, his voice shaking. It was not much larger than a dog, but the creature had an unsightly grin filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth, and it had two horns protruding from its head. And most striking of all, it had a long row of spikes running down its back like some prehistoric dinosaur. It opened its mouth hungrily and crouched, digging its impossibly long and curved claws into the dirt. Oh, dang, Gary nearly shouted as he raised his gun. Grover was the bait. We're the prey. The gun went off just as the creature charged. There was a flurry of screaming and howling, scratching and growling. Shadow met the creature mid-charge and fought it viciously. In the dark, it was impossible to tell where one animal ended and the other began. Gary kept his gun pointed at the fray, but dared not shoot for fear of hitting Shadow. And at last, the creature pulled back from fright and took off through the trees, leaving Shadow. The dog was limping and bleeding, but miraculously alive. It was Gary's turn to bury his face in his dog. Thank you, boy, he said before standing up to check on Nancy. He wandered back to the tree and found Grover still panting at the base of it. Nancy was nowhere to be seen. Gary called out for her, but heard nothing in the stillness of the midnight forest. Great, he said as he pulled a crumpled cigarette from his pocket and lit it. Not exactly what I had in mind for the night. Shadow limped up next to him and nuzzled his hand. All right, boy, Gary said. But once we find her, I'm hanging up my hat for good.